Topic of our Dhamma talk this evening is equanimity. Upekkha in the Pali scriptural language. Now, in the course of this discourse, we'll try to look at various aspects related to equanimity. Aspects that are important both for our daily life as well as for intensive mindfulness practice. Now, a first step towards understanding equanimity is by looking at its etymology. The Pali term upekkha can be traced back, or it consists of two parts, upa and iksh, and iksh meaning seeing or looking is the root for that verb. And when combining this prefix upa and iksh, then the meaning, the combined meaning is looking upon or looking onto. And already that word carries a certain meaning. That meaning does very much apply to what equanimity does and what it's all about. Now, terms that have been suggested, alternative terms that have been suggested for equanimity are equipoise, are also balance, detachment, partiality, and then a literal translation of the Pali term tatra majjhatata is as there in the middleness, or neutrality of mind. And then Shuizan Aung has proposed the term many decades ago, 0 point between extremes such as craving and aversion, fear and delight. Another way of putting this would be as non-reactivity of the mind, or as keeping a proper, or keeping balance here and there. At first sight, one might think there's only one single form of equanimity, but when carefully reading the texts, one finds there are plenty of forms of equanimity, depending on circumstances. Now, based on the Patisambhida Magga, the path of discrimination, the Visuddhi Magga then mentions 10 kinds of equanimity. The first one among those is your 6-factored equanimity, Chalang Upekkha in the Pali scriptural language, followed by equanimity as a divine abode, Brahmavihar Upekkha. Then we have equanimity as an enlightenment factor, Bojang Upekkha. Then equanimity of energy, Viri Upekkha, equanimity about formations, sankupeka. We will talk about this more extensively in the course of this talk. And then there's tatra majatata, upeka, namely equanimity as a specific neutrality. Then jhana upeka, equanimity of jhana, equanimity of purification, equanimity as a feeling, and equanimity about insight. Now, we are not going to cover all those 10 forms of equanimity during this talk, but rather we'll focus on the most essential aspects. Now, various definitions have been given for equanimity, and each definition then covers one particular aspect of equanimity. One definition is as equipoise, and referring to a condition of perfect balance or equilibrium in the intellectual and emotional aspects of the character of a person. And perfect equipoise, for instance, was present in Gautama Buddha, or is present in any arahant. So the condition of perfect balance or equilibrium in the intellectual and emotional aspects of character. The second definition of equanimity is highlighting a different aspect, namely, here equanimity or equipoise is defined as the balance of the 5 controlling faculties, in Pali given as Indriya Samatapatipadana, according to the Visuddhimagga, section 129. So in other words, a balance of confidence in the Buddha and his teaching, of effort in avoiding unwholesome states and cultivating wholesome states, then correct mindfulness at all times, then also involving right concentration and wisdom, panya. Now, in the course of this retreat, the 5 controlling faculties have been mentioned every so often, and it is good to have those 5 controlling faculties arise in one's mind, but it's even more important that the 2 pairs of faith and wisdom and the second pair of effort and concentration are well balanced. And so equipoise or equanimity is certainly here, according to this definition, defined as this balance of the 5 controlling faculties. So equanimity in relationship to the 5 controlling faculties. Now, a third definition highlights a yet different aspect, namely unshakableness and steadfastness of the individual in the face of the vicissitudes of life. In Pali, known as lokadhamma, and there are 8 of those. So in the face of those lokadhammas, the mind remains unperturbed. A righteous person, the texts say, maintains equipoise firmly like the column of Indra at the ancient city gate. So Indra Kila is the Pali term for such a column of Indra, namely, and that then stands as a symbol of firmness. So you have these posts in front of a city gate, apparently at the time of the Buddha. Now, illustrations are important, and here comes a story for this aspect of equipoise or equanimity. Namely, quite a number of years ago, on October 5th, 1989, the Mind Life Institute was carrying out a conference attended by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also attended by a group of scientists. This conference that was happening in a rather private manner at some well-wishers house, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere along the East Coast. It was relatively early in the morning, and the first few participants of this conference on a particular topic related to the mind practice and so on, and philosophy, were already gathering in the sitting room of this residence, and among them was His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It so happened that the phone rang. Someone went to pick up the phone, and Satya then received a message from Oslo, Norway, namely from the Nobel Prize Committee, and the message was that this committee, the Nobel Prize Committee, had just decided that that year's Nobel Peace Prize will be awarded to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, this, of course, great news for any person who would receive such an award. Now, rather than getting all excited and dancing and singing, His Holiness simply carried on with his preparations for the meeting that morning. He did not display any excitement whatsoever. But when it came to the scientists, or at least some of them who attended that same conference, most of them were excited. They were just, they couldn't believe it, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama had just been awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Now, just recently, I saw the introduction to a more recent conference. Again, Mind Life Institute conference with His Holiness and a different group of scientists, and Dr. Daniel Goleman questioned His Holiness about his response back then in 1985, or 89, sorry. And His Holiness replied, well, he did experience happiness. And the explanation was as follows: happiness for his friends who very much wanted him to receive the Peace Prize. And as Dr. Daniel Goleman has mentioned in one of his books on that 1989 conference, well, His Holiness did not display any kind of stronger emotions. This you could take as a very nice story and example of equanimity in action. Now, in a soccer game, let's say an international soccer game, World Cup soccer game, if one team scores a goal, then what do the people in the stadium do? they just they shout and yell and are overjoyed over this goal. Now, this certainly you could take as a case certainly for absence of equilibrium or equanimity. Now, equanimity is not only towards unpleasant experience, undesirable, unwanted experiences, but it is also equanimity remaining balanced, non-reactive towards desirable experiences, whatever those might be. Now, those 8 worldly conditions, loka dhamma, are the following, just to briefly name them, we don't have too much time. Namely, first, gain and loss, honor, and then dishonor or disgrace, blame and praise, and happiness versus suffering or misery. Now, the Dhammapada contains one verse, verse 81, which nicely then conveys this meaning of equanimity as follows. As a mountain of rock is unshaken by wind, so too the wise are unperturbed by blame or praise. Now, equanimity is a quality if we've once experienced it, and it is at our disposal through focused practice, will make a huge difference in life, and will ensure that we can go through life in a rather smooth manner, not being affected by the various desirable or undesirable objects that might suddenly come along. Now, based on the aspects that the Venerable Sadhu Pandita Bhiwams of Burma is highlighting in connection with equanimity, the following, I have put together the following definition. Namely, equipoise is a condition of presence of wholesome mental states, of further balance of these wholesome states, strength of mind, a repelling power of mind, resilience power of mind, and satna, the mind tends to be well buffered, and this satna then can be experienced as a state of strong mental health. Nothing affects the mind. Now, equanimity is also spoken of in the context of the jhana practice, and there it refers to the following, namely an expression that is mentioned in the Visuddhimagga as well as the Vibhanga. One dwells in equanimity. One watches objects, formations, as they arise, thus it is equanimity. One sees fairly, one sees without partiality, is the meaning here. A possessor of the third jhana is said to dwell in equanimity, since he or she possesses equanimity that is clear, abundant, and sound. So these are various definitions that for equanimity that highlight different aspects. The Visuddhimagga offers definitions for all mental factors, including neutrality of mind, tattva majjhattata, as one of the mental factors mentioned in the Abhidhamma. And it's clearly a wholesome mental factor. So equanimity should not be mistaken as a feeling, a neutral feeling, but rather should be understood as a mental attitude of balance, of detachment and impartiality. Its characteristic is as conveying consciousness and the mental factors evenly, and that makes all the difference, because prior to the arising of equanimity, that evenness is certainly not present. Its function is to prevent deficiency and excess, or to prevent certain partiality. It is manifested as certain neutrality, or as the state of being there, a state of ease and being there in the middle. Now, sometimes retreatants and certain non-retreatants end up with a wrong understanding of equanimity and think of it as a state of indifference or disinterestedness, which equanimity definitely is not. Worldly-minded indifference is based in the root, the unwholesome root of ignorance, and has nothing to do with genuine equanimity. So, equanimity is a mental state that does not arise easily, that is not easily available or at the disposal of retreatants. It takes quite a lot of practice to, first of all, experience equanimity, and with that, then to get a somewhat taste of equanimity and an idea of what it's all about. Now, it could be described as a detached state of mind that is unbiased and without losing one's watchfulness and self-possession. And it's actually an intelligent way of responding to the various sense impressions, life experiences that certainly come along. Now, yesterday Marcia spoke first about the perfections, the paramis in general, and then went on to highlight the parami, the perfection of generosity. Today allow me to briefly pick up that strand and then say just a few words about equanimity as a perfection, as a parami. With regard to that same hermit Sumedha, then a Bodhisattva, after he had resolved to become a Buddha, and having renounced his potential to become an Arahant in that very existence, then went on to perfect certain qualities in order to gain Buddhahood. Among those was equanimity. And here is how he admonished himself. Sumedha, a pair of scales remains steady without tipping to one side or the other when poised by equal weights. Likewise, if you remain evenly balanced in mind, when faced with happiness or suffering, you will attain the knowledge of the noble path and noble fruition and omniscience. He then went on to admonish himself further by saying, Sumedha, this great earth shows no signs of love or hate towards all the things that are dumped upon it, whether they are clean or foul. Likewise, Sumedha, you should always remain composed in heart, not being affected either by love or hate. When you're accomplished in fulfilling the perfection of equanimity, you will attain path and fruition and omniscience. Now, Acharya Dhammapala, a commentator who's written a treatise on the perfections, the 10 perfections, defines equanimity as a perfection as follows: as having the characteristic of promoting the aspect of neutrality, and its function is to see things impartially. So that's being highlighted here. And its manifestation is the subsiding of attraction and repulsion. And the reason for, or the proximate cause for the arising of this perfection of equanimity is then to reflect upon the fact that all beings inherit the results of their own actions. Now, when we actually engage in mindfulness practice, it is only after quite a number of days, at least 7 days for the majority, maybe even 8, 9, 10 days, until finally equanimity becomes a distinct mental factor. It is not to say that equanimity is not present in the stream of consciousness at an earlier point of time. It's not that. It is present, but it's still relatively weak and therefore does not show, and therefore is difficult to discern. Now, during a phase of our mindfulness practice that is sometimes referred to as the 10 imperfections of, or a period when the imperfections of insight arise, the so-called vipassana upakilesas, it is towards the end of this that equanimity arises as a mental factor. Now, if attachment occurs or craving occurs with regard to this equanimity, or pride and conceit or wrong view, mistaking it to be an experience of nibbana, then in those cases that equanimity turns into an imperfection. Then it deserves the term imperfection. Otherwise it's a wholesome mental state. Now, during that particular phase in our practice, retreatants are likely to experience two forms of equanimity. One is equanimity in insight, tatra majjhatata in Pali, and certainly the other one is equanimity in advertence. Now, what does this certainly mean? Equanimity in insight simply refers to having seen and observed formations already hundreds and hundreds of times, and thus being familiar with them, more than familiar with them, and certainly with this, the mind then naturally takes on a more balanced attitude. So, this, to express it slightly differently, equanimity in insight is neutrality in the investigation of formations owing to the objective field, or the formations having already been investigated. If you see a movie that is being talked about and praised, greatly praised by others for the first time, you might get quite excited. However, if you've watched that movie already 15 times, then will the mind still be excited? Not. See? And so it's having seen that same movie that for the first time was so exciting, later on loses that certain quality of novelty, and thus the mind becomes quite naturally quite balanced about it. Now, the second form of equanimity that arises during this particular phase in our practice is referred to as awajana upekkha in the Pali scriptural language, which is equanimity in adverting in the mind door. So whatever object we might be experiencing, we will experience it in the mind door at some point or another. And it is the mind needs to advert towards the mind, or otherwise the mind cannot process this object, and the adverting of the mind works incisively and in a very sharp manner, just like lightning flash, like a lightning flash. So right away, with the arising of an object, whether it is desirable or undesirable, it doesn't matter. Whether it is to our liking or not, it doesn't matter. The mind quickly and incisively adverts to it. So this is your second form of equanimity. Now, during this phase of our mindfulness practice, we thus then have gain a first experience of what equanimity is all about. Outside of retreat, for a beginning retreatant, it is quite unlikely that equanimity will arise. Many people don't even understand what is meant by the term equanimity. Now, in the course of our meditation practice, we have plenty of opportunities to do what? There you go. Observe objects over and over again. Now, even the most fascinating experience, let's say some chills or thrills or some far out certain peacefulness that arises certainly in the mind. If we observe those certain phenomena, or if we have observed those phenomena hundreds of times, then the mind starts to relate to those formations in a different way. And that's certainly when equanimity comes in. Now, there is a particular phase, a different phase in our meditation practice, which it's actually an insight knowledge, it's a higher insight knowledge that is not necessarily accessible to the very beginning retreatant. And that certainly is known in the part, that insight knowledge is known as Sankopeka Jnana in the Pali scripture language, meaning the knowledge of equanimity towards formations. Sankhara are your formations, conditioned formations, formations conditioned by anicca, dukkha, and anatta. And jnana is knowledge, and upekkha means, as we know by now, equanimity. So, equanimity, the insight knowledge that consists in having equanimity or bringing equanimity towards conditioned formations. Now, that's equanimity towards certain formations is a quality that, or the insight knowledge of equanimity towards certain formations is a knowledge that does need to arise and that does need to be developed as much as possible. Your mind needs to be strong. Your intuitive wisdom needs to be really well grounded. Otherwise, if the mind, if that wisdom aspect were to be somewhat weak, then the mind will not be ready to gain noble path and fruition knowledge. And the reason is certainly very simple, because the realization of noble path and fruition is basically bringing about a revolution in the mind. So bringing about a major transformation, cutting off certain unwholesome mental states, certain fetters from the stream of consciousness, or eradicating those from the stream of consciousness. And so this can take place successfully only if the mind has a certain strength. Now, that certain particular knowledge of equanimity about certain formations consists, or is a name for equanimity consisting in neutrality about the reobservation of formations, as well as another aspect, namely composure with regard to the hindrances. So two major aspects. There's neutrality in terms of the knowledge of reobservation. So going over those many experiences that have occurred during earlier phases in one's practice, and then the mind eventually becoming pretty neutral, pretty balanced, pretty non-reactive towards those experiences, and secondly, maintaining a certain composure towards the hindrances. The hindrances have a tendency to upset the mind, to agitate the mind, to destabilize the mind. So equanimity upon formations is this neutrality towards neutrality in the reobservation of formations, as well as certain composure. This is just one definition. Other definitions are there. Now, when we look at this unfolding of the knowledge of equanimity, certain major aspects of development can be identified and have been identified by the authors of the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, namely Bhaddanta Buddhaghosa. And so the Visuddhimagga in its 21st chapter, paragraph 66, states the following phases, and these are useful to know in order to possibly recognize those in one's own practice, and they might certainly serve as landmarks along the path. After the first being, after discerning formations as being impermanent, unsatisfactory, and lacking a self, so formations being anatta, and furthermore seeing formations to be void of a self. So time and again a retreatant has to see formations will see formations in the light of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, in order to understand this really deeply. Now, having done this over and over again, gradually that aspect of voidness or emptiness becomes predominant. One realizes that formations are empty of a self. And that emptiness aspect, the sunyata aspect, is actually one of the prerequisites for a further development of equanimity. And retreatants actually do experience that sense of emptiness on occasion. Now, the second phase of this particular insight knowledge can be characterized as after abandoning terror and delight with regard to formations. So whatever formations come up with regard to undesirable, unforeseen objects, terror does not arise. And with regard to desirable objects, delight does not arise. Now, what this point is directing us to is, or what this point is saying, is expressing, might be a better way, is a certain transcendence of pairs of opposites. So the mind, having seen pairs of opposites so many times, it gradually gets tired of them. It gradually realizes that going from one extreme to another, namely from delight to to misery, or from delight to terror or fear, that this is really not all that satisfactory, and it's actually quite painful, if you like to. And having seen this deeply, the mind starts responding to formations in a different way. Now, so after banning terror and delight, after becoming equanimous or neutral in the investigation of formations, which follows from the earlier point, so eventually the mind becomes neutral about formations, equanimous, balanced. It no longer gets excited. So it stays rather in a rather steadfast manner, unperturbed manner. So after these three points have been accomplished, and one continues to observe formations as they are arising, and one then at times sees formations in the light of anicca, at times sees formations in the light of dukkha, or one experiences formations in the mode of anatta. Sooner or later, when the mind is ready, all the necessary conditions are given, then the mind will enter upon the gateway to liberation. And the result of this will involve the realization of noble path and fruition knowledge. Now, the Visuddhimagga goes on to explain this a bit further by saying that either the mind will taste or see formations, or will taste the experience of Nibbana, the peace of Nibbana, or else it will go back to the ordinary experience of conditioned formations. Now, once it has experienced the peace of Nibbana, then it will always want to go back to that state. And there will be a subtle inclination towards that certain state of peace. Now, with regard to the development of equanimity, this knowledge of equanimity, 6 qualities have been mentioned, and these 2 are very useful to then gauge to some extent, or get at least some idea of what is happening in one's practice. The first one is the absence of fear and pleasure, terror and delight, as mentioned early on. The second one is pain and pleasure are seen with equanimity, so are of the same validity. The third aspect is that the meditation is certainly usually carried on automatically and without any extra effort. So the effort becomes effortless effort. The practice is kind of unfolding by itself. Once a certain momentum is there, then it will roll on and on. Now, once that momentum, initial momentum, is there, then one will experience that state of equanimity for longer and longer periods of time. So it becomes quite easy for a retreatant to sit for longer stretches, several hours at a time. Now, as one's sessions are lasting longer, the meditation also becomes more and more refined. And the last point being that the meditation is fixed and steady, the mind recoils and it does not wander off to other objects. Now, as part of the development of this particular phase in our meditation practice, one important aspect needs to be mentioned. When a retreatant gains this knowledge of equanimity for the first time, then he or she might not be aware of the fragility of it, and may assume that it's going to be pretty strong equanimity. Now, if then this retreatant loses his or her mindfulness, the continuity of mindfulness, just for a few seconds, and the mind certainly goes off wondering about this or that, or even engages in some rather agitating thought, then it's quite possible, quite likely, that one's practice will drop off. So one loses the equanimity that one had to work so hard for. And then it might take a while to re-establish that same equanimity. So the practice literally drops off. One finds oneself in a place that certainly is much coarser, and certainly that one knows from earlier days in one's practice. So one has to rebuild everything, and especially by carefully paying attention to the continuity of one's mindfulness, and eventually the equanimity is back. And then one will have to be a bit more careful not to lose it for a second time, which could happen. Now, factors that contribute towards the developing of equanimity are the following, or are understanding, intention, steadiness of mind, spacious awareness, and certainly the enlightenment certain factors, as well as certain wise attention. Some of these points are based on modern research, as described in the book The Buddha's Brain. Now, when it comes to understanding and intention, equanimity arises only when some amount of wisdom has unfolded. Otherwise, it will not arise. So it is a mental factor that in many of the teachings, like the enlightenment factors and other teachings, is mentioned, imperfections of insight, is mentioned towards the end. So it depends, its arising depends on the arising and presence of other earlier factors. So equanimity can arise only when one understands the transient nature of formations and then becomes disenchanted with them. If there's an intention to remain equanimous towards all formations, that might help. Now, to ensure a steadiness of the mind under as many circumstances as possible also contributes towards the arising of equanimity. So, when observing the arising and passing away of formations, then one pays particular attention to it that the mind will not get hooked to any particular object. So let's say if a thought arises with a rather emotionally charged content, then it's important not to get carried away by that thought. If one gets carried away and gets attached to it, wants to find out more about it, wants to think more about it, then the mind is hitching, and that will prevent the arising of equanimity. Now, a certain spaciousness of the mind is given as a further factor that contributes towards the arising of equanimity. It's not necessarily that you can make this happen, but rather that rather this is an outcome of your practice so far. Now, another aspect that has been mentioned in regard to equanimity is the breaking of the link between the feeling tone of an experience and those unwholesome mental roots of craving, anger, and delusion. So the mind becoming independent from the affective quality of an object, the feeling tone, and whatever the feeling might be, the mind remains balanced, and thus then no greed, no anger, no ignorance arises. Now, during this phase of the inside knowledge of equanimity, well, the enlightenment factors are likely to arise one by one, and then all of them gain a certain necessary strength, and next they need to be brought into balance. And among those enlightenment factors is the enlightenment factor of equanimity. Now, with regard to that certain particular enlightenment factor, if we want to develop it so as to realize the Dhamma, then the Buddha recommends wise attention as a factor that will eventually lead to the arising of equanimity and more equanimity. Now, the commentaries have recommended other ways of or conditions that contribute to the arising of the enlightenment factor of equanimity, and the first one being taking an equanimous attitude toward all living beings and not being too attached to any single living being. Be this a human being or some pet animal, some pet or some creature, whatever. Now, also to adopt a balanced attitude towards inanimate objects, such as items of property. Then to avoid people who are deeply possessive. Number 4 is to associate with those who are who demonstrate equanimity. And the last factor or condition is certain to incline the mind, steadily incline the mind towards the rising of equanimity. Now, obviously, much more could be said, with regard to each and every of those conditions, but we just don't have the time for it. Now, it takes hard work to establish that knowledge of equanimity. One will have to battle the hindrances and over time gradually learn the skills to overcome those hindrances, and then do this with a mental attitude of composure. Now, this is possible only through practice. By coming across the hindrances over and over and over again, gradually we become more skilled, and with this, then also the mind becomes more composed. Now, to give you a practical illustration for this certain particular aspect, if you happen to be the retreat manager of a Vipassana retreat for the very first time, and let's say it's like here a 1-month retreat, and then in the course of that 1-month retreat, you'll be confronted with all sorts of situations, some easy to solve, some more difficult to solve. Sometimes you might even end up with a headache. Well, human beings are imperfect. Now, if you've managed to do a quite okay job as a retreat manager the first time, it's possible that you'll be called for a second retreat, and then later on for many more retreats. By the time you serve as a retreat manager, let's say for the 20th time, what about your ability to handle different situations? It will be great. Whatever problem comes along, with the greatest composure, you know exactly what to do. No biggie anymore. You know how to say things. You know how to say things so that the retreatants will not feel hurt or offended. And certainly you will do just the right things. You will know in advance what to do, what to look out for, to make sure there's enough of this and that, and so on and so forth. So that's just a practical illustration for the arising of composure, as well as certain equanimity that comes with experience. Now, many factors can contribute to a weak equanimity, a weak insight knowledge of equanimity. Among those, we have the 3 universal characteristics of anicca, dukkha, and anatta have been not fully digested yet. One does have some understanding of them, but not a really deep. Or maybe one understands anicca and dukkha, but one doesn't really thoroughly understand the third one. So in a case like this, the practice will stall, and one is likely to take loops until finally the necessary familiarity with anatta, to stay with the example, is achieved. Other factors that make it certain difficulty for equanimity to grow in strength is an imbalance of the controlling faculties, as well as an imbalance of the pair of, or the group of more active enlightenment factors, and then on the other hand the group of more passive, more calming enlightenment factors. So in the presence of any imbalance, this insight knowledge of equanimity will not mature. Therefore, we need to work towards as much balance as possible. Now, if a retreatant over days and weeks has not learned the art of observing really carefully and precisely, then when he or she gets to this phase of the practice, the practice might, one's meditation might fall apart. And one might get whatever equanimity one has experienced so far. One might lose whatever equanimity one has gained so far. So there's a number of factors that contribute or represent difficulties in the practice, difficulties in firmly establishing this knowledge of equanimity about formations. Now, we're already well beyond Satna time. Allow me to conclude today's Satna Dhamma talk by wishing, may equanimity arise in your practice, and the initial forms of equanimity, and over time may you gain more and more equanimity towards various sensory experiences, and then over time may your intuitive wisdom deepen stage by stage, and ultimately may you see Nibbana as a state of peace, and may your mind then lean towards or incline towards this again and again. And this is it for tonight.